Hello and welcome to video lecture 5B, Global Moral Decision Making. Let's begin with a brief reminder of a topic that we covered in lecture 1A. There are three kinds of organizations that interact with other countries. Transnational organizations, we could call them. An international organization is one that interacts with organizations in other countries, doing business, cooperating in programs, sharing information, etc. However, it does not have a physical presence in those other countries. No headquarters, other properties, employees, etc. The official footprint of the organization resides in its home country alone. A multinational organization is one that interacts with organizations from other countries and has a physical presence in those countries. However, the strategies, guidelines, goals, etc. will be different from country to country with no overarching strategic management. Each national office creates its own operational strategy geared toward the specific strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats presented by the particular cultural context. A global organization has a physical presence in countries beyond its home country and implements a holistic organizational structure, culture, and strategy that coordinates and maximizes the efforts of the organization across national borders. The adjective global is used here because it places emphasis on the unified efforts of the organization across cultural divides. The adjectives multinational and international stress the diversity and distinctiveness of the different cultures involved. As a rule, global organizations are more effective and more efficient than multinational or international organizations. This is because of the global approach, dealing with cultural differences within the context of an overarching set of goals and strategies. As a rule, this approach produces common motivations resulting in cooperative efforts and unified results, hence the elevated success. For this reason, we will, as we've done all term long, assume a global approach to transnational organizational interaction in this lecture. Now, decision-making in global ethics begins the same place that organizational ethics decision-making in general began, with the moral decision-making method we learned in Lecture 2B. As you may recall, we distinguished between the steps in the two columns of this method. Steps 1 through 5, including the identification of compromise solutions, we called the information gathering phase of the method. At step 6, however, we begin the deliberation phase of the method, and it is here that the real work begins. It is in the deliberation phase that the global nature of global organizational ethics shows its face. Here is where we bring in all the special dimensions generated by the fact that we are making moral decisions concerning organizational behavior in a culture other than our own. These issues can, by and large, be passed over or ignored in domestic organizational ethics, since much of the details are well known or safely assumed when dealing with our own cultures. As soon as we take this method across borders, however, these must be made explicit. Global ethical deliberation must start with Donaldson and Dunphy's hypernorms that we talked about last week. Hypernorms, as you will recall, are, quote, principles so fundamental that they constitute norms by which all other principles are to be judged, end quote. Donaldson calls them, quote, the absolute moral threshold over which no moral decision can cross. We suggested before that Donaldson had something like our primary goods in mind when he's talking about hypernorms. That is, autonomy, rationality, and physical, mental, and social well-being. Donaldson actually offers 3 hypernorms of his own: respect for human dignity, respect for human rights, and good citizenship. This last one is very similar to the kinds of citizenship duties we talked about when discussing corporate citizenship and corporate social responsibility. There would clearly be some overlap between at least Donaldson's first 2 and our primary goods. Nonetheless, a combination of Donaldson's list with the primary goods is a great start on a working list of hypernorms, moral standards that are appropriate to apply in any moral decision making in any culture in the world. Donaldson also introduced us to the notion of legitimate norms. These are cultural rules, customs, or expectations that conflict with the moral sensibilities of other countries, but are nonetheless consistent with the hypernorms. This is where global ethics can get a little counterintuitive. Many of the legitimate norms will be practices and traditions that home country personnel will be uncomfortable with, perhaps quite uncomfortable. They might even involve matters that we see to be moral issues, such as clothing customs, personal relationships, social interaction, etc. But if these are legitimate norms, then it would be morally wrong for home country organizations to forbid or discourage them among their workers, partners, etc. In so doing, they are themselves the ones in the wrong because they are violating the primary goods of host country citizens. But the key point that must not be missed is that Donaldson is calling for a respect for local traditions that are consistent with the hypernorms. So, a good bit of homework will need to be done to determine whether or not those home country norms will give us pause are indeed consistent with the hypernorms. And in so determining, we must be extremely careful to stick with the bare bones requirements of the hypernorms and not let our own home country legitimate norms skew our assessment. This, as you can imagine, is a lot easier said than done. Now you'll notice that I've left room between Donaldson's 2 concepts. This is because I believe there is something that should go between them. This is the moral principles that occupied so much of our attention throughout this course. This includes both the general moral principles and the organization-specific principles we have introduced. Moral principles differ from hypernorms in that they are, as you are well aware by now, prima facie. That is, they can be overridden by other moral principles in certain situations. The hypernorms, however, are absolute. They will never be overridden. Now, this of course entails that the hypernorms will never conflict with one another. That's a very interesting thought, but one we don't have time to explore right now. We'll just assume they don't. The proper role of moral principles, I think, is to serve as a bridge between the hypernorms and our moral deliberations. The hypernorms are very broad and can tend to be vague or too general for ready application to many situations. The moral principles are more specific rules that are, all things being equal, good, reliable ways to apply the hypernorms in many moral situations we will face. Notice that this also suggests a good tool for determining the actual duty when principles conflict. We ask ourselves, which principle is most clearly upholding the hypernorms in this case? If the answer to this question is clear, the dilemma is solved. Furthermore, The hypernorms give us a justification for the decision. This is our preferable action because it is more in line with the hypernorms in this current situation. So, we have the moral foundation for our deliberation in global moral decision-making. We must identify the hypernorms, the conflicting moral principles, and the legitimate norms that are applicable to our situation. Oh, and one final note concerning the moral principles. You may very well find the need to identify what we could call culture-specific moral principles. Remember that we identified organization-specific moral principles, which were principles concerning common problems that will arise in organizational leadership contexts, but not necessarily in ordinary life. Just as specific professions will need specific moral principles to add to the general moral principles, so specific cultures will likely need specific principles that apply to specific kinds of problems that will arise because of the nature of that culture and its norms, legitimate or otherwise. The next step of our global ethics deliberation process is known as the host country laws, regulations, and other binding directives that apply to the moral dilemma we face. Remember, we have an organization-specific principle of legal responsibility. That principle does not apply simply to home country laws and regulations, but to those of the host country as well. So it is critical that global ethics decision makers understand all of the legal obligations in any situation they face. This is essential data for our deliberation and choices. Now, our last three steps involve vital resources for completing our picture of the data critical to our decision. The first of these are the home country customs. This resource goes beyond understanding the country's legitimate norms, even beyond understanding all of their norms. We will look briefly at a couple of tools for a deep understanding of other countries in which we work, in just a moment. The second is the guidelines of the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD. We will look briefly at this organization as well very soon. The third is the home organization's unified strategy for home-host conflicts. We mentioned before that global organizations are typically more successful in dealing with home-host country problems. A big reason for this is that the unified strategy provides more stability and a larger library of past problems, decisions, and process evaluations than the splintered multinational approach. Such a unified strategy is important not just for the strategic management of the organization's various international arms, but for its ethical management as well. If a global organization does not have an established unified strategy for global moral decision-making, it needs to produce one as soon as possible. Resources for devising such a strategy include the vision, mission statement, and core values of the organization's history of dealing with organization issues in the past, as well as information regarding similar organizations and their experiences. And of course, this strategy should be considered with all hypernorms and moral principles in mind. No element of the strategy should be in direct opposition to clear and uncontroversial moral foundations. So we add to the foundational structure of hypernorms, principles, and legitimate norms the first line of critical host country information, the laws, regulations, and other directives of that country. And to these we add three necessary elements for reasonable and effective global ethics deliberation. the host country customs, OECD guidelines, and the details of the organization's unified strategy. So now, it's time to redeem my promissory note concerning the first two of these three elements. There are two very popular and useful tools for analyzing a host country's culture and customs. The first of these, and without a doubt the most popular of its kind, is Hofstede's Cultural Dimensions Analysis. You've probably already studied a bit about Hofstede's program in other classes. If not, there are many other good introductions online. The basic idea is that cultures can be mapped onto several different continuums, each of which measures the degree to which a culture adheres to a given dimension of social dynamics: individualism versus collectivism, masculinity versus femininity, and the others. Now, if you are familiar with Hofstede but have not seen it in a while, you should take notice of a sixth element that has recently been added: indulgence versus restraint, on the bottom of this chart. Again, explanations of this continuum and why it was added are available on many scholarly websites. The second analytical tool for host country customs is Trompinar's Cultural Dimensions Analytical Structure. As you can see, there are a lot of similarities between Trompinar's categories and Hofstede's. For example, Trompinar's individualism versus communitarianism continuum seems to be virtually identical to Hofstede's individualism versus collectivism continuum. However, each scholar's categories seem to contain significant elements of cultural analysis that the other lacks. So studying them both for comparison and contrast is an exercise well worth undertaking. The best understanding and analysis of a host country's customs and their implications for good global ethics deliberation will be achieved from such a study. And your readings for this week include short introductory essays on each of these systems. These are a good place to begin, though a workable study will need to go well beyond these threshold documents. Now, concerning OECD guidelines, I have also provided you with a nice brochure on the organization and its guidelines in this week's readings. The brochure explains the general guidelines that underlie and motivate all guidelines, the general policies that underlie and motivate all guidelines: sustainable development, due diligence, promotion of local capacities, and human rights. The brochure calls these policies, quote, a summary of the objectives and most important recommendations for conduct set out in the OECD guidelines. The brochure then gives a brief description of the principal guidelines to which OECD member countries have committed themselves: disclosure and transparency, adherence to agreed core labor standards, a commitment to environmental protection, combating of bribery and other forms of corruption, consumer interests and the avoidance of manipulation, rapid dissemination of the findings and developments of science and technology, fair competition, and fair taxation. Now, some of you may notice that some of these issues bear resemblance to or have an application to the moral issues that you are dealing with in your project. And so you might want to take a look at this brochure to see if it can contribute positively to your project in your final video presentation. Just a Just a suggestion. You should notice some correlation and overlap with the organization-specific moral principles we discussed in previous lectures, such as disclosure and transparency, consumer interests and the avoidance of manipulation, and others. This shows, among other things, that many of these guidelines reflect guidelines for organizational ethics even in a domestic framework. In other words, they are simply the application of everyday organization ethics principles to the global arena. On the other hand, there are those that reflect the special problems and tensions that can arise as a direct result of the unique characteristics of a home country-host country relationship. These include core labor standards, because labor laws will differ greatly from country to country and may often fall below what we would consider to be in service to the hypernorms. So also with environmental protection, fair taxation, and others. Now, combating bribery and corruption is a very common host country challenge, since such practices are often part of the norm of a country, of a culture, to a much greater degree than they are in the United States. Here, the hypernorms must be brought to bear in judging whether or not those norms in those countries are legitimate norms. In closing then, let's return to the plan for global ethics deliberation we built just a few minutes ago. Note that the three steps in the middle, legitimate norms, host country laws, and host country customs, will all vary from culture to culture, and therefore will require independent, ground-up study with each culture within which an organization operates. These steps constitute what we can call the due diligence phase of global ethics deliberation, research that must be done anew with each new cultural situation. On the other hand, the outside steps, moral principles, and OECD guidelines, are important components of any unified strategy of home-host conflicts. These will remain constant no matter the culture with which we will interact, and will provide the unmoving rock to which the necessarily shifting elements of due diligence will remain moored.